to get to as many questions as we can toward the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we just don't have time to address your specific question. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Maggie O'Farrell is the author of 3 previous books and, of course, tonight's novel, Hamnet, a fictionalized account of the short life of Shakespeare's son, who died at just 11 years of age. Though her extraordinary research is evident throughout the book, at its heart, this is a story about marriage, love, grief, and loss. Moderating tonight's conversation is Amity Gaige, author of 4 novels, Oh My Darling, The Folded World, Schroeder, and most recently, Sea Wife, a transporting work of fiction about marriage, family, and love in a time of unprecedented turmoil. And I'm also going to drop the links for you all to purchase Sea Wife in just a bit into the chat, so make sure you look out for that. But without further ado, it is now my pleasure to introduce Amity and Maggie to PMP Live.
Hi.
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 Hi, guys.
Hi, everybody.
All right.
Hi.
Floor is yours.
Maggie, I think that we are on. How are you?
Hi. I am really well. Thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting being beamed across oceans and continents to appear in America. It's really exciting.
How did you stay up? How much caffeine did you drink in order to stay up for our pleasure?
Actually, only 10 p.m. So it's not kind of really terrible hours, not yet anyway. But you know, if I start falling asleep, you can shout really loudly at me.
10 p.m. super late for me, so thank you for staying up. Wonderful. Well, I know we're going to be treated to a reading, and I wonder if you wanted to start with that, or if you would like to just preface the reading a little bit with maybe a thumbnail of the book. What in your own words, what is this book? And then maybe we could do the reading, and then I'll ask you more questions.
Well, this book is driven, I think, by a long-held belief of mine that I think Shakespeare's son, called Hamnet, who died at the age of 11, has never really been given his due. I feel he's been really overlooked and underplayed by biographers and scholars and historians and screenwriters and other novelists. I feel he's never been his significance has never really been fully attributed to him. And it's funny, I first heard about him. It was actually 30 years ago now, when I was studying the play. When I was 16, I was studying the play at school for my Scottish Highers. I had this absolutely fantastic English teacher who really changed my life and changed the way I saw the world, as all brilliant teachers can do. And he just mentioned in passing one day when we were studying the play, and actually I should probably say that the play really got under my skin, as I think it does for a certain type of adolescent, perhaps the kind of one given to slight melancholy and perhaps wears a little bit too much black eyeliner, which I absolutely definitely was one of those. And so the play, I felt that Hamlet, the character, was really part of my DNA. And in fact, actually, when I was 16, I did go to a fancy dress party and I went as Hamlet. I wore these my mother was really shocked because I wore very, very short black shorts and I had a cape. And I should say borrowed, but actually I stole the skull from the biology laboratory. I did give it back, I should say. So I would think you could probably safely say I was over-identifying with Hamlet. But anyway, so my English teacher mentioned in passing that Shakespeare had a son called Hamnet, and he died probably 4 or 5 years before the play Hamlet was written. And I never really quite forgot this. I do remember, I have a very clear memory of sitting in the classroom and looking down at my cover of the play and just covering the L with a finger and thinking, that name is very similar. What does it mean? I went on to study literature at university and I read a lot of biographies and criticism, of course, about Shakespeare, as everybody who studies literature does. And I remember being really struck by the fact that Hamnet, the boy, if he's lucky, would get maybe 2 mentions in these big sort of 500-page bricks of biographies. They mention that he's born, and then they mention that he died, and his death was always sort of wrapped up in, usually actually, more often than not, wrapped up in statistics about child mortality in Elizabethan times, which of course was very high. But the implication, of course, was that somehow Hamlet's death wasn't really much of a big deal because lots of children died, and even though I was a long way off from being a mother myself, or, you know, even a writer. So it really got me. It's such an outrageous supposition to make that they didn't grieve for him, because I mean, I wanted to say he was 11, and of course they grieved for him. But so I don't know, he's just been haunting me a little bit, this boy, and it's a book I wanted to write for a really long time, actually. And actually, I have written 3 other books. I've tried to write it, and then I swerved away to write 3 others. So anyway, sorry, that's a very long answer to your question. Maybe I should just stop yakking, and as they say in Scotland, and I should just read some for you.
Well, we'll revisit a lot of those issues, but thank you for introducing.
So I'm going to read a part from the beginning of the book where Hamnet, it opens with Hamnet, and he's very anxious, and he's running around trying to find somebody to help him, an adult to help him, because his twin sister, Judith, has fallen ill. She's got a fever. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something, papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. There is a pitcher on the table, and through these objects, his head bent, his breath coming in wheezing bursts. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arm flailing through the air, as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cried. "It's me." Hamnet. His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me, boy," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell, and they've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women, anyway?" He seizes the neck of the pitcher and aims it towards the cup. The liquid, ale, Hamnet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse, then dab at them with his sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamnet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping at his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamnet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. And he thinks for a moment of his mother's hazel strip and the way it pulls itself towards water, except he is not an underground stream, and his grandfather's anger is not like the quivering, divining rod at all. It is cutting, sharp, unpredictable. Hamnet has no idea what will happen next, or what he should do. "Don't stand there gulping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamnet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he is in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stay well back, do you hear? Hamnet believes he is keeping his word. He is well back. He is on the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamnet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tip of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this." His grandfather holds out another paper. Hamnet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Everything happens so fast that afterwards, Hamnet won't be sure in what sequence it all occurred. The page swings to the floor between them. His grandfather's hand seizes him by the wrist, by the elbow, hauling him forwards into the gap, the necessary space his father has told him to observe. And his other hand, which still holds the cup, is coming up fast. Hamnet is aware of streaks in his vision, red, orange, the colours of fire streaming in from the corner of his eye, before he feels the pain. It is a sharp, clubbed, jabbing pain. The rim of the cup has struck him just below the eyebrow. "That'll teach you," his grandfather is saying in a calm voice, "to creep up on people." Thank you. I could read a little bit more, actually, because the book starts with Hamnet, age 11, and it goes back to talk about the parents'
I would love that.
courtship. I could do. There's a quick bit I could read where so the father in this book is never named. The name Shakespeare is never used, not once. And in this, he has sort of various guises, I think, in the novel. In this one, he is a Latin tutor. He's tutoring some boys in Latin at a sheep farm just outside Stratford. I'm on the wrong page as well. That's clever, isn't it? Here we are. The Latin tutor is just about to turn and face his pupils when he sees from the trees a figure emerge. For a moment, the tutor believes it to be a young man. He's wearing a cap, a leather jerkin, gauntlets. He moves out of the trees with a brand of masculine entitlement, covering the ground with booted strides. There is some kind of bird on his outstretched fist, chestnut brown with a creamy breast, its wings spotted with black. It sits hunched, subdued, its body swaying with the movement of its companion, its familiar. The tutor is imagining this person, this hawk-taming youth, to be some kind of factotum to the farm, or a relative to the family, a visiting cousin perhaps. Then he registers the long plait hanging over the shoulder, reaching past the waist, the jerkin laced tight around a form that curves suspiciously inwards. He sees the skirts, which had been bunched up, now hastily being dragged down around the stockings. He sees a pale, oval face under the cap, an arched brow. The tutor moves closer to the glass, leaning on the sill, and watches as the woman moves from the left to the right of the window frame, her bird riding on her fist, her skirt swishing around her boots. Then she enters the farmyard, moves through the chickens and geese, around the side of the house, and is gone. He straightens, his frown vanished, a smile forming under his scant beard. Behind him, the room has fallen silent. He recalls himself, the Latin lesson, the boys, the verb conjugation. He turns, he arches his fingers together, as he imagines a tutor ought to do, as his own masters did at school not so long ago. Excellent, he says to them. They look towards him, plants turning to the sun. He smiles at their soft, unformed faces, pale as unrisen dough in the light from the windows. He pretends not to see that the younger brother is being poked under the table with a peeled stick, that the elder has filled his slate with a pattern of repeated loops. He waits until the boys have half finished their exercise before he says, "What is the name of that serving girl, the one with the bird?" Thank you.
Absolutely gorgeous. Beautiful.
Thank you.
I could listen to more, but we already have some questions in the Q&A section. Brittany mentioned this to those of you who are here, which is an enormous, enormous crowd. Thank you for coming. That you can write in the Q&A section, please, any questions that you have. And towards the last 15 minutes, 20 minutes of our talk, I will try my best to cull from those. But I get to start by asking a couple questions. In your author's note, you write, now I have the galley, so I wonder if there's some changes. In fact, I heard some from what you were reading just now, actually. But your author's note says this: lastly, it is not known why Hamnet Shakespeare died. His burial is listed, but not the cause of his death. The Black Death, or pestilence, as it would have been known in the late 16th century, is not mentioned once by Shakespeare in any of his plays or poetry. I have always wondered about this absence and its possible significance. This novel is the result of my idle speculation. So I would love for you to take us from this idle speculation to the first draft of Hamnet, the book we have now. How did you get from idle speculation about the Black Death to this story about Hamnet and his parents?
Well, I mean, as you'll know as well, because of course, you know, you have written many beautiful, skillful novels. There's no straight line from from having an idea and ending up with the book. So it's, I don't know, I mean, it's a book, as I was saying, you know, it's a book I've wanted to write for a really, really long time, but I always felt, I mean, you know, there were kind of several things that set me off course, I think, in a sense. I mean, one of them was, of course, that it's him, it's Shakespeare. And, you know, I kind of felt, I mean, he is, in some ways, he's sort of untouchable, you know, or should be untouchable in a way, you know. It's not as if he's, not only is he probably the greatest writer that's ever lived, I mean, he's the greatest by an enormously long stretch. There's nobody else that really has come close to him in the intervening 400 years, which is, you know, I mean, you know, it's obviously it's a complete, it's facile to even say this because we all know this, you know, and also we all have, you know, in a sense, we all have our own Shakespeare inside our heads. You know, we've all got our own relationship with him. I mean, he pervades our very language. You know, he defines so many things that we say as a matter of course. It's, you know, quite a lot of which we don't always realise we're quoting him. You know, and his plays, his plays changed the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about others, and I think continue to do so with every sort of new interpretation and every new production that's put on. So I did have a huge amount of vertigo, actually, even contemplating the idea of writing a book about him. But also I had a kind of odd, I had a kind of slightly embarrassing story, but I had a slight odd superstition about writing about it. I mean, I'm not a very superstitious person, but there was something about, I don't know, because I have a boy and 2 girls, just as the Shakespeares did. Although my son's the eldest, it's slightly differently arranged. But I also had a real superstition, actually, as I discovered, because I did, as I was saying, I made sort of 3 attempts at starting, and I would sort of, every time I finished a book, I'd think, okay, now I really need to kind of give it a go. I'll give it a go, and I would do quite a lot of research. And I mean, the thing about Shakespeare is you can always do more research. I mean, you could spend the rest of your life reading about Shakespeare if you wanted to. I mean, people do. There's so much written about him, and so I would do a bit of research, and I would make an attempt, and I had a kind of document on my computer for quite a long time, and I'd have another shot at it, and then I would swerve away and I'd write another book, and I have actually written 3 other books as a kind of distraction instead of writing Hamlet.
So you started this and then wrote 3 books in the meantime, unable to figure out how to approach the story. Okay.
So I wrote a novel about a heat wave in the 70s, and then I had another shot at Hamlet, and then I wrote another novel, then I had another shot, and then I wrote a memoir. And it's funny, when I finished the memoir, I sort of sat myself down and I gave myself a talking to, and I said, either you have to write this book about this dead boy, or you're going to have to forget about it. You can't keep sort of circling around it. But one of the things that did stop me is I was very superstitious about my son. So I found that I couldn't write the books. The thing that was stopping me or blocking me in a way was that I couldn't write the book before my son was safely past the age of 11. Which is, I mean, I know it sounds nuts, because obviously there's not a huge risk of my son contracting the Black Death. No, you never know. But it was probably a slim statistical probability there. But it was just, I don't know, I suppose I knew that in order to write the book, I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who sits beside her son's bed and is forced to watch him die. She's unable to save him, because we all know, you can see in the parish register in Stratford-upon-Avon, that Hamlet Shakespeare, son, it says it in Latin, Filius William, son of William Shakespeare, was buried on the 11th of August. And it's you can't argue with that, it's there. And it's funny, I've told people about the story before I wrote it, and several people's reaction was, because I think I was trying to sort of put out feelers as to how well known Hamlet is and people's perception of him. And several people actually said to me, you can't make it up. You can't make up the fact that William Shakespeare had a son called Hamlet. And I said, but I promise you, I haven't made it up. It's real. You can see it. It's in the parish register. But yeah, so I found that I couldn't really attempt the book properly until my son was safely past that age. He's now a 6'17" so hopefully he's past the kind of.
I don't think people don't realize how superstitious writers really are. I have certain things on my desk that no one can touch, lest I'll disrupt my writing mojo. So I relate to that. But I mean, in some ways, the delay of the book was productive. It gave you 3 other books in the meantime. So perhaps it's the way it absolutely had to go. But then you found your way into the book. So how did you say, you didn't use the word intimidated, but certainly you said vertigo in terms of the amount of the way we worship really Shakespeare, but somehow you found your way into this book. So how did you do that? What was the key?
Well, I think in a sense, the way into it, or the way around this behemoth, of course, is that the book he's not actually the main character. And I think, and obviously there's a very good reason why all the biographies and other novels and screenplays or whatever there are about him, and all the scholarship, why it focuses on him. There's a very cast iron reason why. And also any biography generally, of course, for another very good reason, tends to focus on his life in London, his career. And I knew that actually what my approach would be different, that it was going to be about what happens off stage, in a sense. It's going to be about his family life back in Stratford. Because it's always seemed to me that, the biggest drama, actually, the biggest event of his life, did happen off stage. It doesn't happen in London. It doesn't happen in part of his career, and that is the very early death of his son. And I think I think what's fascinating about Shakespeare, and certainly writing fiction about Shakespeare, is that there's an odd imbalance. We have this enormous wealth of output. We have this enormous, amount of work, and all his plays and his poetry. I mean, only thanks to his two friends. Shakespeare, unlike other contemporary playwrights like Johnson and Marlowe, who made sure before they died they put out these beautiful editions of all their plays, Shakespeare didn't, which something really fascinates me about him. It makes me wonder whether he himself perhaps didn't even realize his genius. I don't know. Anyway, that's another story. But yeah, so we have this enormous wealth of his plays, but actually there's a huge imbalance because we know incredibly little about him. There's such a scant paper trail. I think it's only 6 examples of his signature, and there are very, very few concrete facts about him. There are so many gaps and longueurs and mysterious sort of voids in his story. But in a sense, for a novelist, that's quite, as maybe you'll understand it, it's quite an opportunity because, there are these sort of voids that you can sort of step forward and fill in whichever way you might see it. But yeah, so it was strange, but I think I knew that William, wasn't not going to be the main character. And in a sense, it was quite releasing when I realised that I was not going to name him. I wasn't going to use his name, and the name Shakespeare doesn't appear at all in the book, but neither does William or anything else. I mean, it's partly because, I did try it a few times, but you write a sentence, you're sitting at your laptop and you write a sentence that's, for example, William Shakespeare walked up a path and knocked on the door. And the problem is that instantly you sound like a total idiot and you get yanked out of the story, and you can't, if you're the writer and you're getting pulled out of the narrative, you can't expect readers to stay submerged in it. So that, and then you think, well, should I call him William? Is that really presumptuous? Do I call him Will? It's just as if he's a close personal friend of mine. So the whole thing was just really ridiculous, and I got tangled up in this kind of nonsense. So I just thought, okay, forget it. I'm just going to use, because he is so mysterious, and there are these kind of huge gaps between the sort of definite dots of his life. I thought, well, he can be. And also, something that fascinated me about writing the novel was how others might have seen him at the time. And because, the novel, there are sort of 2 time frames. There's a time frame where Hamnet is 11 and William would have been, I'm calling him William now, I'm going to say Shakespeare, would have been in his early 30s in London. But the book goes back, as in the extract I read, when he's 18 and he meets his wife. And I don't know, there was something about the idea of him at 18, living in this really quite small rural community in Warwickshire in the late sort of mid-16th century. And it just made me question, you think, I wonder, how did he seem? How did he seem to the inhabitants of Warwickshire? What was he like? He must have been extraordinary even then. What was it like? What would it have been like to be his teacher at grammar school, his rhetoric teacher or his Greek teacher, or, having this astonishing and absolutely unique brain and imagination? And I just wonder whether he stuck out like a sore thumb, whether people, how they saw him in a way.
Well, you said a moment ago that the way you could write this was in some ways making him almost a minor character in the novel. He is rendered so beautifully. He's rendered sympathetically and very plausibly, in my humble opinion. But there's no question that this is Agnes's book. This is really, and she is someone, of course, we've sort of left out of the story. You make her such a unique and complex person. So could you describe Agnes as a character in your words?
Well, maybe I should go back to her name, because this is Hamlet's mother, and the woman we, usually know as Anne Hathaway. And, it's funny, because I think one of the things that really, I don't know, one of the things that I think took sort of set me on a different course with the novel was, I originally conceived the book to be about fathers and sons, as of course the play largely is. But actually what happened when I started researching Shakespeare's life, and Shakespeare's in particular his life back in Stratford, his family life, I was so unprepared for the way that his wife would be treated, that I was deeply shocked. I was actually horrified by the way biographers have written about her. And it's so strange. I mean, if we think we have very few facts about Shakespeare, we have so much less about his wife. There's one biographer who just has described her as the wife-shaped void. I mean, because she's an incredibly mysterious character. We don't even have a record of her birth because she was born before parish records were kept. We know that she married him, and we know that she had 3 children. She had a daughter and then the 2 twins. And we know when the children died, we know when Hamlet died, and we know when she died, and we know when Shakespeare died. But that's it, really. There's very, very little known about her. But for some reason, and I don't know why, the sort of paucity of knowledge about her hasn't stopped biographers and scholars, and again, other screenwriters and other novelists from rushing forward and really attacking her. The amount of opprobrium and hatred and actually barefaced misogyny that she has attracted, it just took my breath away. I couldn't believe it. It's a very odd thing, and in our culture, I don't know how she's seen in the States or if it's any different, but certainly if you asked, I don't know, if you stopped someone in the street in Britain and you said, what do you know about the woman Shakespeare married? They'd probably say one of 2 things. They'd say, she lured him into marriage and that he hated her. And there is literally no evidence for either of those things. Yes, she was 3 months pregnant when they got married. And she was older than him. We think she was probably 8 years older than him. But actually that wasn't that unusual in those times. And, I think about 1/3 of brides went to the altar pregnant. It's not unusual. And the last time I looked, it does take 2 people for that situation to arise. There's no evidence actually that he hated. I mean, there's no particular evidence either way, but 2 things really stood out for me is that when at the end of his career, he was he was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He was incredibly wealthy, as well as being an actor and a pretty good playwright. He was actually a very, very good businessman. So he was very, very wealthy, but he chose to live right at the end of his career, he chose to live in really modest lodgings in London. He rented a very small room in a boarding house, and he sent all his money back to Stratford. He bought his wife and daughters an enormous mansion of a place the year after Hamlet died. He bought cottages and fields and farmland, and he leased them out and rented them out, which again makes me fascinated. I always think, well, maybe the people of Stratford had actually no idea what he was doing in London. They had no idea of his genius. Maybe they just saw him as a landlord. I don't know. That interests me. But yeah, so I think I was so fueled by outrage on her behalf. And one of the things that really, really struck me was that I read, in the course of my research, I read her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, was a very successful yeoman. He was a sheep farmer, and he owned a lot of land, and he was pretty well to do. And he died a year before she and William got married. And he left her a very generous dowry. But in his will, in the document of his will, he names her as my daughter Agnes, which would have been pronounced a bit like the French Agnes or Annes at the time. And I was so shocked when I read that, because I thought, surely if anyone would know her real true name, it would be her father. And have we been calling her by the wrong name for almost half a century? And it seemed to me very emblematic of how she is seen, because she has attracted all this enormous vilification. People are so determined, and I don't know why, to give Shakespeare a retrospective divorce. I don't know. And I don't know whether it's because there's a certain, I don't know whether people are wedded to the idea of the kind of maverick loner romantic artist. I really hope it's not that. But anyway, so I wanted to kind of
There is a lovely quote about this that Geraldine Brooks that wrote in her luminous review of the book in the New York Times Book Review, but she said it very well. She said, for centuries, Shakespeare's male biographers twisted the meager facts into misogynistic scenario. An aging spinster entraps a callow youth, and a loveless, mostly long-distance marriage ensues. I mean, I don't know a great deal about the period, but I do know one of the few things I know about Anne Hathaway is that she was significantly older, right? Or that's one of the few details that come to me, right? So yes, you get this moment of sort of reshape when you revisit a historically grounded event. You get a chance to reshape the narrative or add another angle to it, which is very much what you do by just in the very act of making her a central figure in the book. Taking her out of the margins and putting her in the center. And she's so worthy of that because she's also just a very interesting woman. She's very sensual. I wanted to talk about that a little bit too. And in fact, because I found it as a fellow writer hard to tell the difference between her sensuality and that of her author's prose style. Because the book is filled with honeybees and rotten apples and the sense of sex and wax and ink. And it's gorgeous, and you can smell the book. And the sensuality and the materiality of the book is really my favorite part of it. So can you talk about this particular intersection of your writing style with your notions of Renaissance England, especially as sort of an earthy or even odorous place, you know, meaning did your choice of setting kind of draw this detail out of you?
Well, it's funny. I mean, one of the really strange experiences of writing this book is that when you start to write a novel, you know, obviously you know there are going to be settings and there are going to be houses and places and towns in it, and usually you can kind of sort of create them in your mind as you go along. I don't know if you do this as well. You know, the house that maybe your characters live in, you can maybe borrow the garden from somewhere you used to live, or, you know, you borrow the front of the house or the driveway from someone else, you know, and it can be a sort of patchwork thing. But what was really peculiar about this is that, you know, I'd never actually been, but I knew that there in Stratford, you can go and see the houses where these people lived. And so I went on a research trip down there, and it is, I mean, it's an extraordinary experience that I would kind of urge anyone with even a remote interest in literature and Shakespeare to go and see it, because it's, you know, I mean, you know, going back to Shakespeare being quite a mysterious figure, it seems nothing short of miraculous to be able to walk into the town, buy a ticket, and then you're in the house and you are standing in the dining room where he ate all his meals until he left for London, presumably. You can walk upstairs, you can stand in the room he shared with his brothers, you can walk into the room where he was born. You know, it seems bonkers, really, that it's still there. It seems so, you know, against the odds that it survived the intervening time. But what, you know, it's very odd as a novelist, actually, you know, thinking about embarking on writing it, and the house where your book is going to happen, it is already there, you know. So it was a very sort of backwards experience for me, because usually it's the other way around. So I went around it about 2 or 3 times, and I asked that there are these incredible guides at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and they know everything about anything you could possibly want to know. So I asked all of them about 100 questions, and I took loads of photographs, and so it was a strange experience. But I think, you know, I mean, it's funny, I've heard other writers who've written historical novels, and I've heard other people say that they, you know, that they felt very close to them, and they feel as though there was no difference between them and us. But I think I felt the opposite, in a sense. It felt so incredibly, and particularly I think in the lives of the women. So when I was writing about Agnes, you know, I mean, obviously there isn't a lot to read about her, and actually what I did read about her usually made me so cross I wanted to throw it across the room, because they were so vicious with her. So in a sense, my research for her was a lot more kind of physical, because, you know, her life was so different from mine, and, you know, that people have thrown at her, people who for some reason dislike her have said, oh, she was illiterate, you know, she wouldn't have understood or even seen any of his plays. And I mean, the likelihood is she probably was illiterate, actually, but that, you know, obviously it doesn't mean that she was stupid, you know, because she was just never given a chance. But I think women's lives, you know, in the middle of the 16th century are so alien to a woman like me living in, you know, the early 21st century. I mean, it's just, you know, when you look at, you know, how many children, for example, Shakespeare's mother had, Mary. I mean, there were 8 children who survived into adulthood. You know, when Shakespeare got married at the age of 18, she also had 2-year-old Edmund, and she had lots and lots of children in between. I mean, just the idea of rearing that number of children in one house, and thinking every single thing they wore, you probably had to make. Every single thing, you had to wash it by hand. Every single thing they used, bowls, cups, you know, caps, shoes, it all had to be bought and made and laundered, and they're, you know, feeding that number of children, you know, when you, I mean, it sort of beggars belief. So I think to get inside the sort of character of Agnes, I did a number of things. I actually, because one of the things I really wanted to portray in the novel, it was very important to me, was to kind of, I suppose, in the act of giving her back this name, which her father gave, the name her father gave her, her birth name, I wanted readers to kind of, I was asking readers in a sense to open themselves up to a new interpretation of her, of Mrs. Shakespeare, in a way, to kind of forget what they think they know about her, you know, the aging strumpet who trapped this boy into a marriage, to forget about that and open themselves to the possibility that actually they did love each other, that the marriage was a partnership and there was a kind of interchange of artistry between them. And yes, perhaps she was illiterate, but maybe she had other things about her that he, probably the greatest love poet of all time, who wrote so movingly about love and marriage and fidelity and women and men and husbands, you know, maybe he loved her and there was a reason. So I wanted her, you know, there was something that really intrigued me, particularly about Hamlet, actually, the play, is the reach and fetch and range of his metaphors and the knowledge he displays. I mean, it's quite astonishing that, you know, the number of subjects he seems to be an expert in. And of course, herbology is something that appears in Hamlet, and particularly in the scene where the mad Ophelia gives people plants and herbs, and every single one she gives to somebody is a cure for obviously a character flaw she perceives in them. So I decided to give this expertise to his wife. So I wanted her to be a herbologist or a healer. So I actually dug. I should say, preface this by saying I'm not much of a gardener, but I did dig and plant my own Elizabethan physic garden, because I wanted to understand the kind of labour involved in this task. And I went on a course to learn how to make cures from these plants, because, you know, I mean, it's one thing to read it's one thing to read in a library, you know, they used comfrey to ease swollen joints, but, you know, until you've actually got the comfrey seeds and sowed them and nurtured them and watered them and then, you know, dried them and made them into a poultice, you don't really understand. You can't really inhabit that character. So I did that, and I also learnt actually this is probably the funnest thing I've ever done for any novel. I learnt to fly a kestrel. I went down to the Scottish borders and I learnt falconry and hogging, and that was just, yeah, the best thing. I had to do it several times, obviously, to get it absolutely right. But that was, yeah, but they're amazing. I mean, I remember as a child, actually, I think on a school trip, flying a hawk. I mean, I had one try at flying a hawk, and I remember it landing on my glove and it being incredibly heavy. I think it was probably a harrier hawk, actually. But a kestrel is so light, it's like a kitten, and it lands on your glove, and it's almost just the silence of it, the way it moves, is so fascinating. And of course, you know, you don't know those things until you actually do it yourself. So I think it just seemed to me that, I don't know, a woman like Agnes, who is a kind of herbologist and is from that time, I think their lives were actually more wedded to the natural world, a huge amount more than ours is. They were much more, you know, she'd been brought up on a farm, she would have been taught all about how to, you know, to look after the animals and to look after children and the seasons and what would be, you know, to cook, how to feed. You know, she would have been much, much more in tune with the natural world than we are.
Yes, absolutely. That's a beautiful answer. I think it goes into my next one pretty well, which is, I think that readers will be very curious about where you diverge or not from the historical record. And even though I know that, like you say, there's the paucity really of that historical record, but I found myself wondering sometimes, is this factual? When I read the book, did he really have to become a tutor to pay his father's debts? Was his father a drunk? Did you even actually characterize the father? You go quite far on that. You call him the monster of his childhood, the monster of Shakespeare's childhood. So I have a feeling you invented a great deal, as you said, by necessity, but also that the historical record was of just vital importance. This whole book for you took seed with Hamnet, the historical person. So can you give us maybe an example where you purely invented and another where historical facts were essential?
Well, I tried wherever possible, actually, not to go against something that I knew to be true. So if there was a document saying one thing, I wouldn't have just kind of thought, I'll just ignore it because it's not fitting in with my story. I tried to weave around whatever I could find. But of course, that does include invention. I mean, the character of John Shakespeare, the father, William's father, who was a glover in Stratford. I mean, I think, you know, it's quite possible that he was a lovely man and the life and soul of the party, and he and William got on really well. I don't know, and it's quite possible I owe him a big apology. Maybe he was a lovely man, but you know, it's funny. I mean, what's interesting about him is, and this is where my interpretation of him came from, is that, you know, there are, as I was saying, you know, there are very few documents about William, but by contrast, John, who of course naturally is a lot older than William, there is a huge amount. He did leave quite a paper trail, and I think he was a very interesting character. I think because he had been a very successful businessman. He was probably the most successful glover in Stratford. I mean, the house, you know, Shakespeare's birthplace house, the Henley Street, is pretty large. And, you know, he had also been High Alderman at the church, which was the kind of equivalent of being a mayor. You know, he had sort of legal status. He could have, he could sort of act as a magistrate, and he had lots of kind of civic duties. And then, you know, then he seems to have this huge fall from grace. And he, for some reason, I don't know why, he starts illegally trading wool, which he's not allowed. I mean, you know, Elizabethan society was very sort of sequestered. It was very sort of, there were a lot of strange laws that we don't have so much now. You know, you were able to trade within the thing, you know, within gloves, that if that's what you were allowed to do, but you were not allowed to switch trades and do something else. And so he was stripped of his alderman status. He got into huge amounts of debt, and there's an awful lot of, he got into a lot of legal problems. You know, he failed to attend church, and, you know, attending church was mandatory. So he was fined and summoned to court for not attending church. He was also, I mean, really strange things. He was fined for leaving what they describe as ordure in Henley Street. So he'd obviously just dumped a lot of, I don't need to tell you what ordure is. He dumped, which again is a bizarre thing to say. So I just got a bizarre thing to do. So I just got the idea of this kind of probably someone who's a little bit erratic, who'd had this kind of strange sort of fall from grace and this thwarted ambition. And, you know, and I suppose also, I mean, I think, you know, I think with anything with Shakespeare, and certainly writing fiction about him, you have to be very careful, very circumspect about reading too much of his work into his biography, and vice versa. You know, I think that was one thing I wanted to tread very carefully on. But I do think there are a lot of frustrated tyrants in his work. And I wondered where the Coriolanus's and the Macbeths and the King Lears came from. I don't think they come from nowhere, but I don't know. Anyway, that's where my John Shakespeare come from. But I mean, maybe I do owe him a retrospective apology. Who knows? We'll never know.
There are so many questions here in the Q&A, because we have such a massive audience, and I wanted to go to just a couple of them, and then I have another question or two if we have time. Harriet asks, is there a recommendation for a Shakespeare biography, one that you used or valued particularly?
Peter Ackroyd's book is brilliant. I think that was one that I really loved. Germaine Greer has written a fantastic book about Anne Hathaway called Shakespeare's Wife. She is very much, as you could probably imagine, very much against the misogynists who criticised her for so long. It's a brilliant work of kind of fury and also research. Bill Brighton's book about Shakespeare is fantastic, actually. He's written a really good, it's very readable. Who else? I'm going to have to look in the back of my bibliography now. Yeah, so I mean, gosh, you know, there are so many. You could kind of, actually, the one I really loved was Neil Mcgregor's book about Shakespeare's Restless World. I don't know if that's published in the States, but he is or was the director of the British Museum. So he writes about Shakespeare's world in terms of objects from the museum, it's just a fascinating sort of lens into that world. That's probably enough. I could go on, but I'll stop.
That's wonderful, and hopefully maybe we put that, throw that up online on this screen somewhere. We'll see. So lots of really good questions. Paulette asks, endings are so hard. Of course, we can't spoil the ending, but once again, you nailed it. Did you consider or write an alternative endings? For those who haven't read it, it is quite poetic how it comes together, but we can still talk about that question anyway.
No, I always know, it's funny because I find endings, I don't know about you, Amity, but I find endings quite tricky, and often I find I start a book and I think it's going to go from A to B and it ends up going from A to C or D. But with this book, actually, I always knew how and where it would end. I knew it would end in the very famous building in which it does. Maybe I shouldn't say anymore. But also, I think one of the questions that had always burned in my mind, maybe actually ever since that moment in a very cold Scottish classroom when I was 16, I think one of the questions I always wondered was, you know, how did Hamlet's mother feel about the play that was given, that was called after her dead son? I'm not sure I would have been thrilled. So I always wondered how she felt about that, and did she have any say in it?
That is a fascinating question. That question alone, it sort of seems to animate the whole book. And I love how you write that she really isn't told, she isn't apprised of this. There is a great question about one of my favorite moments of the book too, which was, oh no, where'd it go? When people add new questions, they go away. So I don't remember who asked it, but it was the question about the moment where you take, it's almost this mini lecture in how the pestilence traveled across the world via a flea. And the question asker was just, you know, how did you come up with that? It's quite different. You lapse into sort of omniscient voice during this chapter, and it's amusing in a dark way too, the way you describe it. And of course, quite relevant because we are now in the middle of a pandemic, one that we would of course like to understand better, but at the moment doesn't seem that we do. So could you talk about that chapter about contagion and why you put that in?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I didn't particularly plan that chapter actually when I started the book. It just kind of something that came to me when I was writing the first half of the book. So it comes about, I think it's roughly about the midway point in the book. And it just seemed to me as I was writing the first half that there was something quite hermetic about it as a novel. You know, it happens almost pretty much in one house in Stratford. And I just felt as though somehow when I got to the middle of the book, I just suddenly thought, actually, we need to kind of throw this open a bit. I need a bit of air passing through this book. We need a kind of perspective in a way. And it's funny because it is a chapter in which it feels very different to me now, obviously. And at the time, I just remember thinking, I just remember being very aware that the Elizabethans would have been, had the threat of the plague. I mean, they didn't call it the plague, the pestilence, they call it. It would have been at the forefront of their minds almost all the time. They would have been absolutely terrified of it almost constantly. And they would have all known the signs and the symptoms to look out for. Shakespeare's career would have been persistently interrupted by it, because of course the first thing the authorities in London did if there was a case of plague, they would shut down the playhouses. I mean, if you think the original Globe had a capacity of 3,000 people and they were all gathering in the midday sun, you can see why they would shut the play. That would be the first thing they would do. So he would have had to go back to Stratford to sit it out, or if it wasn't too bad an outbreak, he would have gone on tour with his company and surrounding towns that weren't affected. But so I suppose I just was interested in the perception of this illness that devastated whole continents in that century and then centuries surrounding it. And I was just thinking about, it seems really weird talking about that, about how contagion spreads and the sort of chance of it and the coincidence of it. I mean, and the unlucky coincidence of it. So, I mean, it is odd now. And I look back, when I was writing it, as I was saying, I did feel quite distant from the Elizabethans, and I was trying to, it was a kind of active research and also imagination, trying to imagine what would it feel like, to be sitting in your house knowing that there was this deadly disease coming towards you across continents because it swept along trade routes. And I remember having, maps up on my study wall, and was showing the sort of trade routes of Elizabethan ships and how obviously we know now it was the rats and the fleas carrying it, but they didn't know that. And it's odd because now, of course, they look exactly like the infographics we were all looking at in February and March. And I do remember that moment when it arrived in northern Italy. And at that point, of course, I think most people in the UK realised that it was going to come here. It's not a very long distance. So it is. I mean, it was really odd, but in a weird way, it's kind of, retrospectively, I look back on that chapter now, and I feel that kind of stronger bond, I think, with the people in my book than I did when I wrote it in that very odd way. That's a strange sort of side effect, as there are many strange side effects of this current crisis that we're living through.
Well, it is somewhat different for an American audience, and very interesting to hear you talk about how you felt that it was inevitable, because I don't know if we did. And it is also, so interesting to read it for me in this context, and to feel like, normally I sort of otherize that and say, oh, they couldn't understand these things. But I feel that it's quite relevant, because we still feel the same sort of mystery around it. Though we don't use toads to treat people, perhaps, but nor do we have an effective solution either. So that's a quite relevant a resonant part of the book. Diane asks, do you have a favorite Shakespeare play? Did you see and read a lot of them to immerse yourself in the research? And how long did it take? I love the book. Thank you.
I mean, my favorite Shakespeare play is Hamlet. It always has been, and I think it always will be. It's the one that I think it's just perfect, actually. There's not a word out of place. There's not a scene out of place. The whole thing is if you imagine the kind of structure of it as a sort of 3-dimensional object, it would just be perfect. So yeah, that will always, I think it'll always be my first love.
Mm-hmm. Several people are also asking, when you talk about this perfection of Hamlet as a work of art, about the structure of your book, which we haven't really addressed yet, because there are these intertwined, I don't know how the words you use, to splices back and forth. It's so hard to say these things, but between their current, the story of the illness in the present moment with Hamlet, and then the way that Shakespeare and Agnes met, and all of their separate backstories. Several people are asking, did you know you would structure the book that way? How did you arrive at that structure?
Well, it's funny, originally, when I was talking about these 3 books that I wrote instead of Hamlet, I'm getting mixed up myself, and I had actually started a draft of it, and I had this kind of document on my laptop it was about 20,000 words when I finally sat down and thought, no, I really am going to have to give this book a shot. And actually, as soon as I read it, I thought, no, this is all wrong, and I ended up ditching it all. Because I think the first decision you have to make as a writer when you're beginning is at what point along the chronology of the narrative you jump in. If you imagine it's a kind of a straight line, do you start near the end and flash back to the beginning, or do you start at the beginning and go on chronologically? And I'd realized that I'd started in the wrong place. I'd started much too near the end, and actually what I needed to do was come right back to the beginning, and I needed to start with him, with the boy. So that's what I did, and somehow, I don't know, it's like a kind of key turning in a lock. It's somehow the whole book sort of suddenly opened, and I was able to do it. I found a way in. So it's not, but actually, in some ways, I tend not to write chronologically. I find chronology a bit of a tyranny in terms of narrative. I don't think, as human beings, our brains and our memories, I do work in a very neat sequential fashion from A to B. I think we're much more layered. I think of it as much more sort of like geology. We're much more layered in that way. But actually, I think in one way, the kind of narrative of Hamlet is actually probably one of the simplest chronologically that I've ever written in one way, in the structured way.
Right. Well, that present day story is rather short, but there's such depths behind that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, chronology is straightforward. It's rather boring. The meaning
it's overrated.
Meaning is created from rearranging the story, as you do. Julia asks, your description of Agnes's grief is profound and beautiful. How much did you identify with her experience while you were writing, and was it difficult to write? I think, the scene, it's not a spoiler, of course, to say that she grieves in the book. So was it difficult to write?
Well, it's funny, I was looking back, I keep a diary, and I was looking back at a diary a few years ago for an entirely different reason, looking back for something, and I came across this completely, this double page. It was completely blank, and it just had one thing written on it, and it said, "I killed Hamlet today." So I do remember when I was coming up to the point of, in that part in the book, of absolutely dreading it, and I kept thinking I should just probably go back and fix that bit at the beginning, or I should probably just, and I kept sort of distracting myself with other things. But it was, I think it's probably one of the hardest things I've ever written, actually, because you know, as any parent will probably know, I think it is your worst and most visceral fear to lose a child, to have to bury a child. I actually can't imagine anything worse, anything at all. And I think to write those scenes, it was horrible, because you are imagining, you know, your absolute worst nightmare. And it's funny, I found that I couldn't actually write them in the house where my children live. I actually wrote them in, in a shed in a garden. And when I say shed, you have to, if you're thinking a kind of nice, glamorous sort of garden office, a bit like Philip Pullman's, it's not at all like that. It was a really disgusting, dilapidated kind of potting shed. It's actually since blown down. It blew down in the winter. So I sat in this really kind of manky, sort of spidery, roof-leaking potting shed with lots of blankets on it because it was freezing. And I wrote it in sort of maybe 15 or 20-minute bursts, and then I would have to undo all my blankets and have a little walk around the garden, and then I would do it again. So it did take a lot out of me. And also it was heartbreaking, you know. I loved this boy, you know, and I kind of got to know him, and there are, despite all my best intentions, there are elements of my son in him. So it felt like a terrible wrench to do that. So that's why I remember now why I wrote that in my diary, that I had to do it. It was going to happen, and I had to do it. And you know, it was that weird stuff. You know, it's a little bit like watching Romeo and Juliet. I always find whenever I watch it, I always think, oh, maybe he will get the letter. Maybe the friar isn't going to mess it all up, you know. But of course, it always does. And it had, you know, I suppose I was thinking of Hamlet's death in a similar way, or what it was like for me watching Romeo and Juliet. You always hope it's not going to happen, but you know that line is there in the parish register. It's going to come. It's going to happen.
Right. I read I Am, which is your memoir, and it's subtitled 17 Brushes with Death. And many of those were your own brushes with death, but some were with your children. So you write, the effects of living with a child who has a life-threatening condition, of losing someone who could at any moment be snatched from you. I think about this a lot. So the connection is obvious because this book preceded Hamnet, but I'm wondering if you learned anything more about this theme or this sphere of parental grief, or the danger of parental attachment, through pushing that subject through the sieve of Agnes Hathaway's experience.
I mean, I think so. You know, I think it's funny when sometimes it's only after you've written a book that you realize why you've written it. You know, I think it can sometimes take a few years for the wheel to, you know, to turn in that sense. And I don't know if I could have written Hamlet actually unless I'd written the memoir. You know, I never ever thought I'd write a memoir. It was always seemed completely antithetical to me. You know, I'm very, very wedded to fiction and very wedded to novels, and the idea of, you know, writing a memoir would have been absolutely horrifying to me. So in a way, I don't know, I suppose I was. I mean, obviously, you know, if you read the last chapter in my book, which is about my daughter's life-threatening condition, you can see why that was why I wrote the book, because I was obviously thinking an awful lot about what it means to come close to death, or what it means to kind of, as it says in the Bible, in the midst of life we are in death. We're all thinking of it, you know, we're all thinking about it. We're all walking about with this kind of, this inevitable day, you know, that will happen for us all at some point. So I don't know if I could have done it, but there's you know, but I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there is a certain amount, I think there is a certain element, I think, of my daughter in Judith. And she's, of course, the child who comes back from the brink. I'm able to, in a sense, keep her living. And Judith, the real Judith, lived for an extraordinarily long time. So I think she was 67 when she died. And that's something that fascinates me. And the other daughter, Susanna, the older daughter, she lived a really long time too. In those days, you know, if you can think, the average life expectancy was 47. So I'd be a goner now because I just turned 48. You know, it's astonishing they lived so long. But I think what really I find very heartbreaking, actually, when I think about those two sisters, is that at the time they died, about the time they were old ladies, the first sort of biographers were writing about Shakespeare, but not a single one of them thought about going to Stratford and asking his daughters what he was like. And you think, oh my God, what a missed opportunity. You know, imagine what we would know about him if just one of them had thought, I'm going to go to Stratford and see what I can find out. But nobody did, sadly.
Angela wants to know, she says she's read all your novels and your memoir. She wants to know if you're working on another novel, and can you tell us anything about it?
I can say yes, I am working on a novel. But actually, going back to superstitions, this is one of my superstitions. I'm very bad at talking about novels I haven't written yet. I mean, it's funny, actually, I did, one of the things I found it quite hard, actually, to leave Hamnet and Stratford behind. And it kind of took me a while to let them all go. I just loved them all so much, and I wanted to stay with them a bit longer. So I did have a little tiny break, and actually I've only very recently taken down my photographs off the Shakespeare house, off my pinboard. And so I couldn't decide what to write next, and I actually started 3 books in tandem. My husband thought I was nuts, because I actually had 3 desks, and I had each novel on these 3 desks, all in quite a very small room, I should say. My husband come in and say, "Oh my God, this is his absolute worst nightmare way of working." But there is one and it is actually another historical book. But I can't really tell you anything about it because I'm very superstitious. But no, I'm quite excited, actually, and I'm really enjoying it. It's very different from Hamlet.
I can't believe I even asked you that question. I'm sorry. I sort of
no, it's fine.
I feel the writer to writer pact by just trying to get people the answers they're looking for. But there's one, I will do one last question, and then I know I want to wrap up and respect everybody's time. It's a lovely one about Shakespeare and, oh God, I've lost it again. Oh, okay. So Mark says, can you please talk about Shakespeare's understanding of desire and longing in his real life romance and how that manifests in his plays? And there's a couple questions about this actually up here as well. Talk about his understanding of desire. Yeah. And how, yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly I think he has an incredible understanding and, you know, ways of communicating love and desire in a time when it was probably quite, in some ways, quite taboo to talk about that kind of thing. You know, I think he writes brilliantly about many, many different kinds of love, you know, romantic and familial and sort of dutiful love. And, you know, I think it's, you know, he is, I mean, he's often called the greatest love poet. And I think he is. I mean, it's fascinating. You know, there's so much speculation about his life and his romantic life and who he loved, and you know, there's all sorts of theories about, you know, and one of the questions I always wonder is, he must have, I mean, clearly he was a very sexual being. That's, you know, I think we can all see that. But you know, and he was away from his wife, who I think he loved, in London a lot, and you know, he lived in this very sort of free and easy theatrical world. You know, I don't think it wouldn't shock me to learn that he had lots of affairs. But, you know, one of the things that fascinates me, and, you know, there is a whole theory about whether he had affairs with men as well. You know, some of the sonnets appear to be about men or, you know, directed at men. And some people say this is a proof that he did have affairs with men. Other people say, well, they were written for, you know, for patrons, for other people. Who knows? I mean, you know, the thing is, we don't know. It's fascinating. It would be fascinating to know, but nobody knows. But one of the things I quite like to speculate about is that, you know, there are no direct descendants from Shakespeare. Judith, of course, Hamlet died when he was young. Judith had 3 sons, one of whom died in infancy, and the other 2 died again in midsummer in a plague year. Within 2 weeks of each other, they were 20 and 21. And Susanna had a daughter, but her daughter married twice but had no children. So there are no direct descendants of William Shakespeare at all. But I do wonder whether there are direct descendants of him walking about London. I hope there are.
We'll never know. I think that's a wonderful point to put on it, and want to thank everybody for coming this evening, no matter where you are in the world. Maggie, your book is beautiful. Clearly, people are so interested in it, and there's many questions we didn't have time to answer. I know Politics and Prose likes to jump in, and yeah, hi Brittany. How are you?
I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you for this conversation. This book is absolutely incredible, clearly as evidenced by the number of people who came tonight. I'm going to be emailing everyone the link again to purchase both Hamnet and Sea Wife, which is Amity Gaige's book. And just thank you all so much for joining. It's events like this that keep independent bookstores like Politics and Prose alive. So we just can't thank you all enough.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. And thank you, Amity, and thank you, Brittany. It was just wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
Hi, Maggie. Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Bye, everyone.
I will. Yes, certainly. Keep well. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.